Hello and welcome to our lovely presentation of the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals 5. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. So the purpose of the CELF-5 is to evaluate strengths and communication needs. It addresses parent and teacher concerns and helps to develop the IEP. It is sensitive to cultural and linguistic diversity. It helps to gather evidence to determine if problems with spoken language extend also to written language, and it also helps to begin collaboration with teachers and reading specialists in order to identify possible reading and writing difficulties. The CELF-5 uses norm-referenced and criterion-referenced tests to better identify deficits in social language. So the CELF-5 plays a huge role in the initial steps of clinical decision making, which of course encompasses a lot, including identifying communication strengths and weaknesses, identifying the deficits in reading comprehension and written expression, as well as measuring the treatment efficacy. If, though, the language disorder is found after administering 4 to 6 tests, the CELF-5 can also determine other factors, such as significant differences between comprehension and expression, if the student has weaknesses in areas of morphology, syntax, or semantics, how the oral language disorder might affect written language skills, and if an identified disorder affects students' social language interactions. The test is meant for a population with the ages ranging from 5 to almost 22 years. Appropriate tests for age ranges are provided in the test manual. So the aspects of language and cognition tested include a lot: semantics, morphology, syntax, pragmatics, and memory. It also includes the Observation Rating Scales, ORS, for authentic evaluation of communication in academic settings. The composite scores are comprised of five subcategories: the core language score, receptive language, expressive language, language structure, and finally language content. So regarding the feasibility of the test, in order to obtain the core language score, it takes about 30 to 45 minutes. The entire assessment, though, is quite variable. The core tests for students who are ages 5 to almost 9 take about 34 minutes, and then a little bit longer for the older students, ages ranging from 9 to almost 22. You have to factor in an additional 9 to 16 minutes for the receptive language score. Materials do not include a lot. The first is the examiner's manual, second is technical manual, and then the stimulus books 1 and 2, observational rating scale, and the record forms 1 and 2. So where would you administer this test? Have a quiet, well-lit room free from interruptions and distractions, and be sure to practice and study the test beforehand. Telepractice is an option with the CELF-5 Digital Kick, CELF-5 Scoring on the Q Global, and CELF-5 on the Q Interactive. So what are the characteristics of the normative sample? Well, it's the U.S. population, ages 5 to 21, and they're all English speaking. The standardization sample was based on the March 2010 U.S. Census update and was stratified by age, sex, race, ethnicity, geographic region, and parent education level. It involved more than 3,000 individuals ranging from the west to the south, and 20% of those individuals were bilingual. 27% spoke a dialect other than Standard American English, 4% were gifted, 11% had diagnoses including but not limited to ADHD, a learning disability, intellectual disability, pervasive developmental disorder, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, developmental delay, or emotional disturbance. 12% were diagnosed with a speech and/or language disorder, and 3% were receiving occupational or physical therapy. So the sensitivity group included only 67 children, ages ranging from 5 to almost 16. Unfortunately, this is a really small group to rely upon. The test is only 57% accurate in identifying children who have a language disorder at 2 standard deviations below the mean. So we're on to the reliability and validity. The average reliability coefficients of the subtests range from an adequate to an excellent level. The sentence structure, though, is 0.75, whereas the rest of the range is 0.85 or above. Regarding the reliability of index scores, for all of the composite scores, they reached an excellent level. The test-retest reliability, for individual subtests, it was a 0.7 to a 0.9, which is quite adequate stability across time. Regarding the composite tests, they ranged from good to excellent. Regarding the interscore agreement, it was a 0.99 for word structure, 0.95 for formulated sentences, and a 0.91 for word definitions, and a 0.96 for structural writing. So, evidence based on response processes. Items were deleted that students found too difficult to answer, or examiners found too difficult to score, or if they were ambiguous or had low inter-rater agreement. So this ensures that the desired response processes are being effectively elicited. Regarding the evidence based on internal factors, the connectedness between tests and composite scores. The core language score had a high correlation with most of the index scores. The expressive language index and receptive language index have moderate to high correlations with other index scores. And the index scores for language content, language structure, and language memory correlate moderately with one another, but still at a lower level than other associations. So, Dolligan's Diagnostic Evaluation Checklist. Participants were identified prospectively. They were clearly described. They included individuals with and without the disorder of interest. The participants exhibited a range of severity levels. They did include some with confusable symptoms, and the measure was compared to a number of gold standards, actually, not just one. So first of all, the CELF-5 was compared to the CELF-4 to demonstrate similarities and differences, as well as the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, 4th edition, and the Expressive Vocabulary Test, 2nd edition, in order to determine how it relates to other language measures. All three were valid, reliable, and reasonable. And all of the gold standards were administered to all the participants. The test manual, though, did not specify whether the two measures were administered independently by different examiners, the 4 measures. And the test manual did also not specify whether the examiners were blinded to performance on other tests or to other patient information. Regarding the likelihood ratio, the LR plus value was actually deemed invalid, as well as the LR minus value. So we, had a little bit of trouble deciphering that, but those were the results that we found. The confidence interval, fortunately, was reasonably narrow, and the new measure is feasible in usual clinical practice. And finally, the new measure offers a significant advantage over the gold standard. Gold standards, plural. So, how do you administer the CELF-5? So first of all, there are verbal responses to picture stimuli, and each test has its own specific direction, so it can get a little bit complicated. So regarding start points, younger ages, which are specific to the test, start at number 1. And then if the child has a suspected language disorder, they also start at number 1. If, though, the student does not begin with item 1 and does not obtain a perfect score on the first 2 items administered, the clinician must go back to item 1 and administer all of the items before the start point. Regarding discontinue rules, indications of where to stop testing are designed in order to minimize testing time without losing information about the student's abilities. So the clinician sits next to the student at a table so both can see the stimulus book and there are no barriers in the line of vision. The clinician does not tell them if they are right or wrong or how many times they answer correctly. Clinicians, though, can make general comments such as, "We're almost done," or "I like the way you're working." Certain tests allow for repetitions, but these repetitions can only happen once. Short breaks are allowed, but clinicians must try very hard to time those breaks at the end of a test so that demonstration and trial items do not have to be redone. If you prefer, a tablet-based administration is available. So, the test scaled scores for the norm reference scores include raw scores, scaled scores, confidence intervals, percentile ranks, test age equivalents, and gross scale values. The composite scores are made up of the core language score and index score, which are further broken down into the core language score, receptive language, expressive language, language content, language structure, and language memory index scores. There are also criterion reference scores. So here is the beautiful Katie who administered the recalling sentences subtest, where the client is required to restate a sentence that the clinician produces.
Awesome. So listen to another one and say it exactly as I say. Does Mr. Gomez teach reading?
Does Mr. Gomez teach reading?
Great. All right, so now let's try some more. Remember, listen carefully and say exactly what I say because I can only say it once. All right. Does anyone know who the new teacher is?
Does anyone know who the new teacher is?
Was the van followed by the ambulance?
Was the van followed by the ambulance?
Because tomorrow is Saturday, we can stay up late tonight.
Because tomorrow is Saturday, we can stay up late tonight.
The book was not returned to the library by the teacher.
The book was not returned to the library by the teacher.
The coach could not find the uniforms that the team wore last year.
The coach could not find the uniforms that the team wore last year.
So as you can see, the scores are divided up into no scores, if the client has no errors, they receive a 3. If they have 1 error, they receive a 2. If they have 2 to 3 errors, they receive a 3. And if they have more than 4 errors or 4, they receive a 4. So this is just an example of what Katie was just administering. So over here we have the sentences, and then over here we have the scoring. And then corrections are made based on the client productions. So here's an example. After the students had finished the book, the teacher asked them to write a report. And since the client omitted had, she had 1 point taken off of 3 and resulted in a 2. And so on from 19 and 20. So, the subtest that was administered again was the recalling sentences, and the client had a raw score of 57, which is converted to a scaled score of 14, with a confidence interval of 12, with a range of 12 to 16. So, an interpretation of the client's score is that she's performing far above what is expected for her age. And if she were to take this test again, we are 95% positive that her raw score would be between 12 and 16 again. Yes. So regarding the percentile ranks, because the client received a scaled score of 14, she was put into the 91st percentile. So again, an interpretation of this is that 91% of the same aged peers scored at or below the client's score. So if she were to take this again, we are 95% sure that she would score in the 75th to 98th percentile. As you can see, a raw score of 57 dictates an age of 12 years and 1 month. We must keep in mind this is a gross estimate of her performance in relation to students of all ages in the normative sample. And if you are interested in using this to report progress, if the test is given more than once to the same client, you can refer to the gross scale value, which is in Appendix G1. And thank you so much.